When the question is asked, what is the worst NFL draft class in recent history? Most people's answers would be 2013's, and for good reason, as the 2013 draft class was definitely horrendous at the top with all the awful offensive lineman draft picks, guys like Deion Jordan, Barkevious Mingo, Tavon Austin, D. Milliner. And yes, it is a bad draft class, but I'd like to make the argument that just a couple of years earlier in 2009, there was an even worse draft class. Now I know Pro Bowls and All-Pros aren't the only thing that should be judged from these draft classes, but just a quick little comparison between 13 and 09, 13 has more standalone Pro Bowlers, multiple-time Pro Bowlers, All-Pros, multiple-time All-Pros, and Hall of Fame caliber people, because at least the 09 draft, while it was bad at the top, other than Lane Johnson, it did at least give us Travis Kelce, who's arguably the greatest tight end of all time, DeAndre Hopkins, Tyrann Mathieu, David Bakhtiari, Darius Slay, some really nice players. Also Travis Frederick, Le'Veon Bell before, he had his issues, and Xavier Rhodes had a couple of nice years. There's some decent players in this draft class. Just of the players to make an all-pro team, which were 12 of them, only 5 of which came in the first round. The best parts of the draft class were not the first round picks. And while the best parts of the draft class in 2013 were the guys after round 1, what if I told you in 09, there is no good parts of the draft class, as only one guy made multiple first team All-Pros. And now let's just not compare this to 2013. Let's compare the 2009 draft to the rest of their peers over a 7-year span to see where this draft class truly falls into in terms of really bad draft classes. Taking a look at the graph that we have here of the 3 draft classes that came previous to 09 and the 3 that came after 09. So from 06 to 2012, this 2009 class ranks dead last in every category, and it's not even close. As when it came to the Hall of Fame tab, obviously some of these players are either still active or not eligible, but they're gonna make the Hall of Fame, and I have a couple, bubble players, that's why it's 7 to 9, 2 to 3. But we know the 2011 draft class was stacked on talent. We know the 07 class past Jamarcus Russell was amazing at the top. But even still, these classes produced 13, 11, 14, 15 All-Pros, had 30 plus Pro Bowlers, and some had even 40. The multiple time Pro Bowlers as well, as you can even see the 08 draft class was pretty poor, but even still the 09 draft class is considerably worse than a weak class, which was 08. But like I said at the start, Pro Bowls and All-Pros are not the only determining factor of what is a good draft class, because the depth of these rosters are not Pro Bowlers and All-Pro type of players. Were there productive players? Were there good players? Were the first rounds maybe just neutral, not good, not bad? Today we look at the 2009 NFL Draft, a draft which started where a player got literally sent to hell, a disastrous top 10, the Browns inexplicably doing a good job compared to every other team. Movies were made, jobs were lost, and butt fumbles did happen. This is the 2009 NFL Draft. The draft kicked off with the 0-16 Detroit Lions with the number 1 overall draft pick, and they selected, out of Georgia, Matthew Stafford, and I will say that that is about as good of a draft pick as you're going to get in this class, as Matthew Stafford was incredible, and I truly don't understand how there are Lions fans out there who don't appreciate everything Matthew Stafford did for that team and how hard he tried to make that team a success. I'm willing to bet if almost any other team, aside from a handful of teams that were poorly run and had some bad QB situations around this time, drafted Matthew Stafford, in almost any other organization, he would have been a Hall of Fame quarterback. Now, some will still argue now that he's a Hall of Famer, but even though he has the Super Bowl ring and the longevity statistics, I just don't think he did enough to be a Hall of Famer. Too many bad seasons in Detroit, but that's not because he's not a Hall of Fame caliber player. Matthew Stafford was a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback that unfortunately wasted way too much of his time in Detroit. Now, things for Stafford did start off the best in Detroit, as he only played 10 games as a rookie, got a season-ending injury in 2010, but in 2011, I really want to put over how great 2011 was for Matthew Stafford, who threw for over 5,000 yards and 41 touchdowns, winning Comeback Player of the Year, winning 10 games. The biggest argument held against his time in Detroit is, well, he never won a playoff game. Well, he's on the Detroit Lions, and there are 2 very damning statistics when it comes to him, and I don't care if he had Calvin Johnson. The rest of his team was abysmal at times, and the head coaching, just incompetency, was there as well. As I will tell you that he had more last-ranked defenses than top 10 defenses. Only once in his career in Detroit did he have a top 10 defense. And would you look at that? That was the year he won the most games. He had 11 wins. For less than half of his career, he even had a top 20 defense. Only 5 seasons did he had a top 20 defense. And also, his rushing support was abysmal. He had only 11 games in his entire Lions career in which a running back ran for 100 yards for him. That little rushing support makes it almost impossible to be successful. So you have no defense, no running game, and Stafford and Calvin are out here playing for their lives trying to make that team look good. Let me just rattle off a couple of things that Matthew Stafford has done in his career and some records that he holds, as he is the fastest player to reach 30, 35, 40, 45, and 50,000 passing yards. Also, I know about half of his playoff games came in LA, but for those who like to argue that he is bad in the playoffs or can't win playoff games or anything, even when he was in Detroit, among his 8 playoff games, he has the most passing yards per game in playoff history. And on top of that, that wild 2016 season that he had, in which the Lions won 9 games, and he set an NFL record with 8 game-winning drives and 8 fourth-quarter comebacks, having a wild season in terms of his clutchness. Matthew Stafford has done so much for the Lions, and I'm glad that he finally got to go to LA, win a ring, and prove that he is every bit as great of a quarterback that we have known that he can be. And this is not meant to just be a dig at Lions and Lions fans everywhere, but man, I would have loved to see Stafford have a career just somewhere else. I wanted to spend a few minutes about Matthew Stafford just so I can be a little bit more positive in the video, because man, does things fall apart very quickly, as immediately this might be the worst 2 through 4 I have ever seen. As with the number 2 pick in the draft, the Rams went with tackle Jason Smith out of Baylor, who suffered a concussion in 2009, missed the rest of his rookie season, immediately got beat out in his second season, got traded, and was out of the league on practice squads in 2013. It is a very quick fall off for Jason Smith, who, despite having a 6-year, $61 billion contract, couldn't even make it to the end of that deal, and the Rams whiffed bad, and that is not the only time the Rams have missed that badly on a offensive line prospect at number 2, as if you can remember, Greg Robinson, so the Rams have not had good luck at that spot. I'm going to skip the number 3 overall pick real quick because there's a good reason for that we'll get into, but the number 4 overall pick, Aaron Curry, who is considered the slam dunk great player in this draft class, the number 1 guy regardless of positional value. The Seahawks, who didn't even need a linebacker at that time, took him because he was going to be a guaranteed great player. They gave him the most guaranteed money a non-quarterback rookie has ever gotten in NFL history, and a $60 million contract in total. And by 2011, he had lost his starting position to KJ Wright, who would go on to be a part of that Super Bowl winning Legion of Boom defense, and Aaron Curry was traded for a 7th round draft pick. Both he and Jason Smith were out of the league in 2013, as neither of them got to play out the 6 years that their contract initially had them signed for as a rookie. But now let's circle back to the number 3 overall pick, Tyson Jackson. Now, the reason I saved him for last is because he was the feature in Kansas City for what was the worst draft class in one of the worst draft classes in NFL history. And Tyson Jackson was the most successful of these 3 players, though it wasn't a high bar, as he was at least still in the league in 2013. He played out 5 years in Kansas City. He actually did play out the full contract, though he did not play all that great. He signed on to Atlanta to be a backup. He finished up his career in 2016 and is the shining bust on what is a top-to-bottom awful draft class for Kansas City as a whole. I do challenge Kansas City fans, how many of these players do you remember? Alex McGee, who played just over a season and had 4 career sacks. Donald Washington at defensive back, who just started 5 games. Colin Brown, who didn't even make the team, basically. He was on the team in 2009 and never played. What about Quentin Lawrence with his 1 career catch for 9 yards? Or Javarius Williams, who had 6 carries for 6 yards? Or backup tight end Jake O'Connell, who had 15 career catches for just 100 yards. Actually, their best player was their last draft pick, kicker Ryan Suckup, who played for 5 years and hit 81% of his field goals. But in total from this draft class, the Kansas City Chiefs had 13 sacks, 5 starts at DB, 6 rushing yards, and 16 catches for just over 100 yards from an entire draft class. That is impressively bad, and the Chiefs, I think, easily take the crown for the worst class in the 2009 draft. Stafford was not the only quarterback drafted in round 1, but he certainly was the only good one, as with the 5th pick, the Jets made a big move trading up from pick 17, and honestly, they got a good deal. The Jets traded 3 players, none of which were all that great. The best one they traded was Albert Elam, and they only had to otherwise give up their 2nd round pick to move up from 17 to 5. That's a pretty good deal, but then they whiffed the draft pick and took Mark Sanchez. Now Mark Sanchez, coming out of USC, only had 16 career starts, did not play all that much, but the Jets loved him, moved up, and while Mark Sanchez did manage to make 2 AFC Championship games behind a great defense led by Revis Island, no one attributes the success of the Jets to Mark Sanchez, and a lot of people think that they succeeded in spite of Sanchez, who had just as many interceptions in his career as he did touchdowns, and after his 4 years on the Jets, he would only wind up starting 11 more games in his career. He managed to start 8 for the Eagles in 2014, for those of you who remember his time with the Eagles. He is one of many bad QBs drafted in the 1st round, and he had a pretty insignificant career, and maybe with a good quarterback, the Jets could have found themselves in a Super Bowl, and it is disappointing for him that he is most remembered for his time in the NFL with the butt fumble. Quite the legacy Sanchez leaves, but a much more forgettable quarterback in this draft was a 17th overall pick, the Buccaneers, who were 9-7, picking in the middle of the draft, trying to get their future quarterback selected, Josh Freeman. He was one of those guys in the draft class who came around, and all the coaches and GMs loved him because he's 6'6", 248 pounds with a cannon arm. He's the prototypical quarterback. He's athletic. He can do everything. He can make all the throws. But man, he had a lot of work to do, and when you get a player like that and you get him in the building, you understand that he's going to take some time. He's a bit more raw, and the Buccaneers didn't exactly handle him the best, I will say, but also he didn't do himself any favors. Now, honestly, he had a pretty impressive 2010 season in which he went 10-6. Unfortunately, the Bucs missed the playoffs at 10-6, but he threw for 25 touchdowns to 6 interceptions, and it really felt like the Buccaneers had their guy of the future, as when you put that kind of statistics up in just your 2nd season, you're a little ahead of schedule when it comes to your development, and the Buccaneers actually thought they were going to make a push. They went out, made moves, and then in 2011, everything just fell apart immediately as he regressed all the way down to 16 touchdowns to 22 picks, and in a prove-it type of year in 2012, he progressed all the way back up to 4,000 yards, 27 touchdowns, 17 picks, but after disputes with coaches, teams, and just really he could not get along with anyone. It felt like he was cut in 2013 and only ever started 2 more games after being cut by Tampa Bay, and was out of the league at 27 years old. And he was a guy who had all the talent to be successful, and at times even was a little successful. He just could not put it all together. It's always fun to go back and see some of these old draft classes, because hindsight will tell us that some teams inexplicably made bad decisions and picked one guy over another, even at the same position. But what about the times where even in the moment you know it's a bad pick, or you know they picked the wrong player? It doesn't happen a crazy amount, but it happened here with the 7th overall pick. The Raiders took Darius Hayward-Bay strictly because of Al Davis and his love for speedy, big guys who are raw and talented, but they passed up on Michael Crabtree, who was the consensus #1 receiver, the guy that everyone had on the top of their board. Hayward-Bay was a late first-ish type of player, whereas Crabtree was like a top-tier talent in this draft. This was an instance where the draft experts and all the fans and everyone watching was correct, except for the team that made the draft pick, as Darius Hayward-Bay, while he did have a 900-yard season one year, was unable to really develop into a great receiver as a whole and was off the team in a couple of years. But Darius Hayward-Bay, I will say, made his money in the NFL as he was able to stick around for a long time as a gunner for the Steelers and Colts. So he was able to develop into a great gunner, but I mean, for the 7th overall pick, he ended up becoming a gunner for another team. That's pretty poor, obviously. Now, they passed up on Michael Crabtree, who was the clearly better player. I know he wasn't some slam dunk amazing pick. At no point were you saying Crabtree was an elite receiver, but he was the much better player, had some really nice years, helped be a primary target on a Super Bowl contending team in San Francisco. Despite what Richard Sherman says, he is not a mediocre receiver. He was a little bit better than that. He even ended up playing on the Raiders and putting up an 1,000-yard season for them, so I guess the Raiders ended up with him in some capacity anyway. But this was a major mistake, and one that not only was bad in hindsight, but everyone knew it at the time. Now, the question of who the absolute just worst player drafted was with a high premium pick. While Jason Smith was bad, and Tyson Jackson was bad, and Aaron Curry was bad, Aaron Maben is worse than all of them, as with the 11th pick, the pass rush specialist was taken out of Penn State for the Buffalo Bills, and he was so bad that he was only able to start one career game for the Bills, and by his second season, he was listed as a healthy scratch during games throughout the year, and in 2011 was just straight up cut. In his entire Bills career, his stats are as follows: 24 tackles. That is it. He went to the Jets in 2011 and actually put up 6 sacks, which is pretty impressive, I guess. And then in 2012, he did nothing, and then he was out of the league. So, I mean, for a team that was able to draft a player and get literally nothing out of him, for no reason other than the fact that he just wasn't good enough, at least with Jason Smith, he got injured, missed his rookie season, got beat out. With Aaron Curry, he was at a loaded linebacker room, he got beat out by KJ Wright, who was a nice player. Aaron Maben wasn't even good enough to be an active member of the roster. He was a healthy scratch and never recorded a single sack in Buffalo. Like, that is about as bad as it gets for a player. Now, the other pick here at number 24, the Falcons go at Perry Jerry, a D tackle, and this one, maybe he's not as bad as Aaron Maben, but still as rough as it gets, man, because he was a 25-year-old rookie defensive tackle, which in itself, I don't even know how you draft that in the first round, but to make things worse, he immediately got a season-ending injury, and he wasn't able to play basically until he was 26 years old. So already that's an incredibly old rookie basically, and he was only able to stick around for 4 years post the knee injury. Started 29 career games, 5.5 sacks, really ineffective, and didn't do much of anything. But man, I don't know how you draft a 25-year-old rookie. I guess that's just me personally. I could never do such a thing. That is just way too old to be drafting somebody like that in the first round. And to make things worse, I mean, you're expecting a player like that to be at least good early on because he's further along in his development, but then he just sustains a knee injury, and it's just about all over. We've already talked about a lot of bad defenders that came out of this first round, but let's talk about some of the good ones, as in round one, there were some shining examples of great drafting and great players taken on the defensive side of the football, as with the 13th overall pick, the Washington Redskins at the time took Brian Arakpo, who was an awesome player, and despite having some injury troubles in his career and not able to really hit his full potential, he was still really good, as he had 11 sacks as a rookie, 10 sacks in 2013, also went to Tennessee and had a double-digit sack season, was a 4-time Pro Bowler, and finished his career with 66 sacks as a whole. As a Washington fan myself, I was a big fan of Brian Arakpo, and having him and Ryan Kerrigan as an edge rush duo for a few years was really fun. And then with the very next pick, it hit back-to-back. That's the first time in this draft we got back-to-back good players. With the 14th pick, the Saints took a very important piece to a Super Bowl winning defense, as they selected Malcolm Jenkins out of Ohio State. Jenkins had a long career both in Philadelphia and in New Orleans, where he won a Super Bowl with each team and had a couple of really great years. He made 3 Pro Bowls, even made a second-team All-Pro, and finished his career stuffing the stat sheet with over 1,000 tackles, 20-plus picks, 20-plus forced fumbles, put the ball in the end zone even 7 times, broke up over 100 passes, one of the absolute best players to come from this draft class, and a player in Malcolm Jenkins that isn't talked about enough as one of the more underrated defensive backs of the 2010s. He was really good. Not a Hall of Famer, but really good. And then with the 25th overall pick in the draft. Rest in peace, Devontae Davis. He was selected by the Miami Dolphins, and he was more than just a player who retired at halftime that one time to end his career. He was actually a really nice player before then, when his time in both Miami and Indianapolis, making multiple Pro Bowls, grabbing over 20 interceptions, and having a pretty nice couple of years where he was among one of the better corners in the league. He was never like a top 5, top tier type of corner, but a really good number 1 who was able to be successful on both Miami and Indianapolis, multiple teams where he was able to succeed. And he unfortunately did pass away pretty recently, but we are going to acknowledge that he was a very, very good football player in his time. So great pick by the Miami Dolphins. Now you might be wondering who from this draft class could have possibly been the rookies of the year. And it was 2 pretty fun players, but unfortunately 2 players who basically peaked as a rookie in their first season, as the offensive rookie of the year was a player that I love very much and would have loved to see have a healthy, full run, or maybe just be a player in the modern day NFL, as if he were coming in nowadays, he'd be a whole heck of a lot of fun. That being Percy Harvin. The Vikings drafted him to be a dangerous duo with Adrian Peterson, who was fully in his prime by this point. In his rookie season, Harvin was able to put up over 750 receiving yards, over 130 rushing yards, over 1,100 kick return yards, put the ball in the end zone 8 total times, and just be an all-around weapon for the Vikings. Now, unfortunately for him, he did sustain injury troubles, but by no means would I call Harvin a bad pick, as despite some injury troubles, he was also able to put up an 800-yard season, a 900-yard season, get the ball in the end zone quite a bit, and he had a kick return touchdown each of the first 4 years of his NFL career, including he also holds the interesting record of the longest non-scoring play in NFL history, a 104-yard kick return that did not score a touchdown. But injuries caught up with him, and he was eventually traded to Seattle in the 2013 season, where he basically did absolutely nothing except return a kickoff for a touchdown in the Super Bowl. So he got a Super Bowl ring with Seattle, and then basically was just done for, as in 2014, 2015, 2016, he was in Seattle, New York, Buffalo, never had more than 400 yards, and just was not able to stay on the field either. A lot of injury troubles, but a fun but short career for Percy Harvin, who I think really would have thrived in today's NFL especially. Sadly, things don't get better on the other side of the football, as Brian Cushing was the 15th overall pick to the Houston Texans, and as you can see there, he put up a pretty crazy rookie season. Just stuffed the stat sheet with 133 tackles, 12 for a loss, 4 picks, 4 sacks. He also had 2 forced fumbles and a safety with 10 pass breakups. Just an insane year where he made the Pro Bowl. Both him and Harvin made the Pro Bowl as rookies, and both seem to have bright futures. But much like Percy Harvin, Cushing dealt with injury troubles, as he had a nice 3-year run, and by 2012 though, season-ending injury. He signed a long-term contract, then season-ending injury, and when he finally was able to play again in 2014, he was still able to be a starter for 2 to 3 years, but not able to really reach the highs that he was hitting early in his time. But he managed to put together 3 solid years. Both him and Percy Harvin had 3 nice years to start their career, and then just got slapped with injuries left and right. Unfortunate for both of them, as I would have liked to see both of their careers, go off without just injury troubles, but just how it is sometimes. And both these rookie of the years just had unfortunate luck in their time in the NFL. But I'd like to talk about a bit more positive things, as this draft class has been awfully negative so far, but we've had a couple of positive things as of late. And let's get into one of the best picks in the entire draft up next. Is it weird that in one of the worst draft classes ever, the Browns did a really good job? And the Browns around this time were pretty addicted to making bad decisions, and I guess still are addicted to making bad decisions. But the Browns did a phenomenal job, as they started off with the 5th overall pick. They traded all the way down to 17, then traded down to 19, then traded down to 21, and still snagged arguably the best player in the entire class, as they selected Alex Mack at center, who went on to become a phenomenal center, one of the best of this era, and he started in almost every game in his career, made 7 Pro Bowls, was a 3-time All-Pro on the second team, and was just an amazing rock-solid player. If there's one thing the Browns were able to do over the past 15 years, is they've got some good scouting on the offensive line, as they were able to bring in Joe Thomas and Alex Mack around this time, and the offensive line that they've built over the past few years has been pretty nice. They haven't really been able to do much with it, but they've had a nice offensive line. And Alex Mack, like I said, made 7 Pro Bowls, which is the most of any player in this draft class. So the Browns get a big, victory there, as they were able to trade down a number of times and draft one of the best players in the entire draft class, as Mack would also go on. He'd play in Atlanta, he'd play in San Francisco, he'd make a Pro Bowl on every team he ever played on, and he was just, like I said, an amazing player. So, weird to say it, good job from the Browns. We already talked about who the worst class of the 09 draft was, that being the Kansas City Chiefs. But how about the best draft class? That going to the Green Bay Packers, who, while they did have 2 first-round picks, were able to snag some really nice players. They traded up to the 26th overall pick, gave up a 2nd and 2 thirds, so they didn't pick again till the 4th round, but these are the first 3 picks that they made. They went number 9 overall and selected BJ Raji, who, while he's the worst player of the 3 and the highest drafted, still made a Pro Bowl, was a key contributor on a Super Bowl team, as he got the pick 6 in the NFC Championship, and was just a decent player for a couple of years. But where the real stars come out is at the 26th overall pick. That is Clay Matthews, who was the 2nd most Pro Bowls and tied for the most All-Pros in general, as he made a first team and a second team All-Pro. He had over 90 sacks, 100 plus tackles for loss, had an amazing career, and is one of the greatest Packers defenders of all time, and also helped on that Super Bowl run, of course. And then their first pick outside of the first round was in the early 4th round, and they go and snag TJ Lang, who was a multiple-time Pro Bowl guard and was a part of a really nice Packers offensive line alongside Josh Sitton and eventually David Bakhtiari. A really solid draft. They didn't really do much elsewhere in the 5th, 6th, and 7th, but this is a draft class that lacked a lot of great players, later in the draft, and they still managed to snag 3 Pro Bowlers, including 1 key player on offense and 1 amazing player on defense. It's about as good as you're going to get for this week of a draft class, and this eventually helped win the Packers a Super Bowl, as all 3 of these players were key contributors. Now, what about outside of the first round, as there is always good players in day 2 and 3 of the draft. Now, this draft, again, not as much as other drafts, but there was still some really nice guys to talk about. The Buffalo Bills had 2 first-round picks. We talked about one of them. Aaron Maben was the first, and their 2nd pick in the first round was center Eric Wood. But the best player they drafted was safety Jarius Byrd, who as a rookie came right out the gates hot with 9 interceptions and made 3 Pro Bowls, was a 2-time second-team All-Pro, and had a nice couple of years where he was one of the better safeties in the league. Now, his career did not last all that long by comparison, as he was pretty much out of the league in his early 30s, and his peak was only really about 4 nice years, but still a really solid player drafted. And what about the 49th overall pick, Max Unger, who was another good center? Alex Mack, who was obviously, we talked about him and how good he was. Eric Wood did make a Pro Bowl, and then Max Unger here was a second-team All-Pro and a 3-time Pro Bowler who started 130 games. Also was a part of that very, very weird trade where he was swapped for Jimmy Graham, but, both in Seattle and in New Orleans, he was successful, made Pro Bowls in each spot, and was a really nice player. You can argue this is the best player in the entire draft. At the 53rd overall pick, the Eagles selected LaShawn McCoy, who was one of the best running backs of his time, over 10,000 career rushing yards, was very efficient, was very good, made 6 Pro Bowls, made 2 All-Pros, 6 1,000-yard seasons, won the rushing title one year with over 1,600 yards, had 89 career touchdowns, just so good, so entertaining to watch. And while nowadays he's a really bad analyst on television, don't let that distract you from the fact that he was just a really, really fun player and was one of the most entertaining guys in the entire league when Chip Kelly had that 2-year run, and he, Deshaun Jackson, another player they drafted in this draft class, Jeremy Maclin, that 1 year Nick Foles had that was really good. And also, like Max Unger, was a part of a really, really odd trade where he was just straight up swapped for Kiko Alonso, and about as bad of a trade as you can make, but Chip Kelly wanted Oregon guys. He succeeded, though, in Buffalo, eventually found himself in backups and other places, but Sean McCoy, in his time, one of the best running backs of his era. Usually, you'll look back at a draft class and find that a couple of day 3 guys always slide in to become very nice players, very successful players, and have long careers, and there were not very many notable players in day 3 of the 2009 draft. And here are the best of the bunch, though, as Glover Quinn was a very nice safety, if you remember him in Detroit. That's where he made most of his big plays, but he started off in Houston, where he played out his rookie contract. He then signed with the Detroit Lions, where in 2014 he had an amazing season, racking up over 70 tackles and 7 interceptions on his way to a Pro Bowl selection, a second-team All-Pro, and Glover Quinn ended up carving out a 10-year career where he was a consistent starter. In fact, Quinn was able to start all but 4 games in his entire career. Never had injury problems, never dealt with anything, was just a full-time starting safety from day 1 for 10 years. So that's really impressive. And for a 4th round pick, obviously you are in love with that. He succeeded in both Houston and Detroit, but we have to skip all the way to the 7th round to get our next notable player. Now, we already know TJ Lang was drafted in the 4th round, so I didn't really feel like repeating him. So he was obviously another day 3 pick that was very nice. But in rounds 5 and 6, there was a whole lot of nothingness going on. So in the 7th round, we have Pat McAfee, who was arguably the best punter of the 2010s. And honestly, this was a really nice draft for punters because they also had the other contender for best punter of the 2010s in Thomas Morstead. So if you're into the punting, this was a draft class for you. But McAfee made the Super Bowl as a rookie, 2-time Pro Bowler, and All-Pro. Didn't have a long career. That's because he's doing a lot of stuff off the field these days. But McAfee was a very nice player to snag in the 7th round. And then what about almost at the very end of this draft, the 232nd overall pick, Julian Edelman, who, well, I will go out here and say, he's not a Hall of Famer. Don't try and convince me he's a Hall of Famer. He's not a Hall of Famer, but he had a really nice career, and especially for a 7th round pick to rack up over 6,000 yards, 40 total touchdowns, 3 1,000-yard seasons. He never made a Pro Bowl, but he won Super Bowl MVP and helped the Patriots dynasty in the 2010s. There were 6 wide receivers drafted in the 1st round in 2009, and Edelman ended up outproducing 4 of them, coming just behind Jeremy Maclin and Michael Crabtree. Also, fun fact that I didn't cover him in a day 2 pick, but the all-time leading receiver from this draft class is Mike Wallace. So he was a 3rd round pick that I didn't talk about, but I wanted to bring him up. And as we wrap things up here, I wanted to show the entire 1st round and the hit rate, as that we didn't talk about every single player picked in the 1st round, but I just wanted to show what I thought were the hits and the misses of this draft class, as while I do think that this draft class was bad, I do think there's a lot of harshness when it comes to what they consider a hit or a miss in a 1st round. It's really hard to draft, and it's really hard to produce good players, and it's really hard to get successful players. We even see it on the graph. Any given year, there's, 30-ish Pro Bowl level players, maybe 10 that make an All-Pro. So the standards for, what is a good draft pick are a little too high, in my opinion. For example, Brian Cushing made an All-Pro, made a Pro Bowl, won Rookie of the Year, put in 3 really productive seasons, was a starter for, I believe, 5 or 6 years overall. Got that the 15th pick. It's hard not to consider that a hit. And I think if you go and you make multiple Pro Bowls, or make an All-Pro, or a very long-term, very good starter in this league, that's more than, that's way more than what you're getting with other draft picks in the 1st round. That is incredibly good by comparison, because, you could get a guy like Beanie Wells, who was out of the league and out of a starting position in a few years. Same thing with Donald Brown. Same thing with Pariah Jerry. Same thing with Josh Freeman. Larry English was awful, and we didn't even get to him. There's a lot of very, very poor players. So I even consider, a guy like Hakeem Nicks, who never made a Pro Bowl but had a couple of 1,000-yard seasons. That's a pretty neutral pick, especially also relative to where they're drafted. If Kenny Britt was a top 10 pick, that's a miss. But at the 30th pick, a guy who gets 6,000 career receiving yards and is a 1,000-yard receiver and has started over most of his career, it's a fine pick. So, you can let me know what your, standard of a hit or a miss is, or what you consider a good or a bad pick. What's a bust to you? I think the word bust is thrown around a little too loosely, but for me, This draft was obviously horrible, especially the top 10, especially the top 5, but the middle produced its most successful group of players because it produced a great center, multiple Pro Bowlers, Super Bowl winner, rookies of the year. It produced some very productive starting players and some guys who just had their careers cut short due to injury. The back half of the first round, very poor, as, only Clay Matthews and Vontae Davis were productive. But overall, very bad draft class, though. And I still will make the argument, this might be a worse draft class than 2013. I know 2013 is like the consensus, that's the worst modern draft class. But man, it's hard for me not to look at 2009 and say that's the worst draft class. And you all can let me know what you think the worst draft class, I'd say post 2000 is. I think that's what we can consider, this era, this millennium, this generation, whatever it is. What do you think the worst draft class is of that time? And do you agree that it's 2009? Do you think it's 2013? Do you think it's another year? There's a lot of draft classes then doing my research that I felt like were really interesting to cover. And in going through, maybe we'll do another video down the line of a good draft class and maybe an underrated great draft class. But I hope you all enjoyed. Let me know what you all think, and I will see you all in the next one.